Welcome to the Warfront Stories World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. December 17, 1944, 12:45 p.m. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. The pristine snow blanketing the Ardennes forest reflected a deceptive serenity. 4 miles southeast of Malmedy, the Baugnez Crossroads, known locally as 5 Points, stood silent under the leaden winter sky. Corporal Ted Palach of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion rubbed his gloved hands together, his breath forming ghostly wisps in the frigid air. At 22 years old, the Philadelphia native had been in Europe for 6 months, following the front lines across France after the D-Day landings. None of the men in the convoy knew that today would forever change them. None knew they were about to become unwilling participants in what would be recorded as the single largest mass murder of American troops in Europe during World War II. "Something terrible is going to happen to us today," one of Palach's fellow soldiers had said that morning. The words now echoed ominously in Palach's mind, as their convoy of 30 vehicles carrying approximately 140 men rolled through the crossroads. The stillness was shattered by the unmistakable crack of tank fire. From the tree line emerged the dark silhouettes of German tanks and half-tracks. Their engines roared like predatory beasts stalking through the snow. This was the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the personal bodyguards of Adolf Hitler himself, now leading the vanguard of Nazi Germany's desperate last offensive in the West. The Americans never stood a chance. The first and last vehicles in the convoy erupted in flames. Black smoke billowed skyward, a stark contrast against the white landscape. The convoy was effectively trapped. Men scrambled from their vehicles, seeking cover that didn't exist in the open snow-covered fields. Within minutes, the brief, uneven battle was over. Surrounded and outgunned, the Americans raised their hands in surrender. None of them could have imagined the horror that awaited them in a frozen field beside the crossroads. None knew they were about to become victims, and a few survivors, of what history would record as the Malmedy Massacre. December 17, 1944, 9:30 a.m., Malmedy, Belgium. The morning air bit at the faces of the men of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion as they prepared to move out. Heavy clouds hung low in the sky, promising more snow before day's end. The battalion had been ordered to relocate to St. Vith, some 20 miles to the southeast, where they were to support the 7th Armored Division. Private First Class Harold Billow, a 21-year-old from Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, loaded his gear onto one of the unit's trucks. Like most of the men, he was young, drafted in 1943 and trained specifically for artillery observation, not direct combat. Their job was to spot enemy positions and direct artillery fire, equipped primarily with binoculars, maps, and radios. The 285th wasn't a heavily armed unit, Billow would later recall. We were just the eyes. We weren't like the infantry, out there fighting. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion stationed in Malmedy, approached the convoy's officers as they reviewed their planned route. "I'd advise taking an alternate route," Pergrin warned, pointing to their maps. "We've had reports of German movements along your planned path." The convoy's commander hesitated, then shook his head. "We have our orders. We'll proceed as planned." This fateful decision would seal the destiny of scores of American soldiers before the day was done. At 11:30 a.m., the convoy of trucks, jeeps, and weapons carriers formed up and departed Malmedy, heading southeast on Route N23 toward Saint-Vith. In addition to the men of Battery B, the convoy included medical personnel, military police, and other support troops. Among them was technician 5th grade Theodore Ted Palach, whose grim premonition of something terrible had unsettled his comrades at breakfast. Warren Schmidt, A Pennsylvania native, like many in the unit, sat across from Palach in the crowded truck. Neither man spoke much. The rhythmic rocking of the vehicle over the rutted road was punctuated only by occasional muttered comments about the cold. Military policeman Homer Ford was positioned near the front of the convoy. A traffic control specialist, he had been attached to the 285th to help guide them to their new position. He had no way of knowing that in a few hours he would be laying motionless in blood-stained snow, listening to the moans of dying men and the methodical execution shots of SS troops. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the convoy approached the Baugnez crossroads, where Route N23 intersected with N32, forming a five-way junction. The men in the lead vehicle saw nothing unusual as they passed through the crossroads and continued southeast. They were unaware that just minutes earlier, intelligence reports had detected German armored units moving rapidly westward in this sector. These were the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most aggressive armored battle group in the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, personally tasked by Hitler to spearhead the offensive and reach the Meuse River at any cost. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, a fanatical 29-year-old Nazi decorated with the Knight's Cross, was driving his men mercilessly forward. Having broken through American lines the day before, Peiper's battle group was now probing deep into Allied territory, seeking to exploit the element of surprise that was central to Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes. The American convoy, with its thin-skinned vehicles and lightly armed troops, was about to collide with one of the most formidable and ruthless combat units in the German army. December 17, 1944, 12:45 p.m. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. The crack of cannon fire shattered the winter silence. The lead Sherman tank of Kampfgruppe Peiper emerged from the tree line approximately 800 yards east of the crossroads. In seconds, more German vehicles appeared. Panzer IVs, Panthers, and half-tracks filled with SS troops in distinctive white winter camouflage. The first American vehicle erupted in flames as a high-explosive shell found its mark. Almost simultaneously, a second German tank fired at the rear of the convoy, striking the last truck and effectively blocking the Americans' escape. "We got blasted," Harold Billow would later remember with stark simplicity. Inside the American vehicles, confusion reigned. Men dove from their trucks, seeking cover in shallow ditches beside the road or behind their own vehicles. A few returned fire with M1 rifles and carbines, but they were hopelessly outgunned by the German tanks and automatic weapons. First Lieutenant Virgil Larry shouted for his men to take cover, then watched in horror as one of his fellow officers was cut down by machine gun fire from a half-track. Blood sprayed across the pristine snow, creating a macabre pattern of scarlet droplets. Ted Paluk found himself huddled behind a disabled Jeep, its windshield shattered by bullets. Next to him, a medic frantically worked on a wounded soldier, his hands slick with blood that steamed in the frigid air. "It wasn't much of a fight," Palak would later testify. "We were artillery observers, not infantry. We had carbines and maybe a few .30 calibers, but nothing to stop tanks." Within 10 minutes, the brief, one-sided battle was over. With German tanks advancing from both sides and SS troops fanning out to encircle them, the surviving Americans had no choice but to surrender. Approximately 120 American prisoners were rounded up at the crossroads. The Germans disarmed them, confiscating watches, rings, cigarettes, and personal items. The Americans were marched to an open, snow-covered field adjacent to the crossroads, near the Café Baudarway. First Lieutenant Larry stood with his hands above his head, facing one of the German tanks. An SS officer emerged from the turret and fired his pistol twice at Larry. Both shots missed, but the next round struck and killed a captain standing nearby. Despite this ominous beginning, the surrender proceeded. An SS officer who spoke perfect English announced, "First Panzer SS welcomes you to Belgium." The Americans were ordered to form ranks in the field, standing in the snow with their hands raised. Some were separated for questioning about unit strength and dispositions. The majority of prisoners stood in the open field, shivering in the biting cold, uncertain of their fate but expecting transportation to a prisoner of war camp. None of them could have anticipated what was about to unfold, an atrocity that would shock the Western Allies and galvanize American determination in the desperate days of what would come to be called the Battle of the Bulge. December 17, 1944, 1:30 p.m. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. The American prisoners stood in neat rows in the snow-covered field, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Despite the frigid temperature, many were sweating beneath their woolen uniforms from the exertion and fear of the preceding battle. Now they waited, hands held high, as SS officers moved among them, occasionally selecting men for interrogation. Kampfgruppe Peiper's main column of tanks and half-tracks had begun moving past the crossroads, continuing westward toward their objective. The prisoners watched as vehicle after vehicle rumbled by, their German crews sometimes staring at the captive Americans, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Private First Class Homer Ford stood in the front row of prisoners. He noticed an SS officer conferring with several others near an armored car. Their gestures toward the American prisoners caused Ford's stomach to tighten with apprehension. At approximately 1:30 p.m., an SS officer standing on a tank turret raised his pistol and fired a single shot. The bullet struck an American medical officer who had been treating wounded soldiers. The medic collapsed into the snow, blood pooling beneath him. This single shot served as a signal. Suddenly, machine guns on the half-tracks opened fire on the defenseless prisoners. MG-42s, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, swept across the closely packed Americans. Men fell in rows, their bodies crumpling into the snow. It was like cutting wheat, survivor Ted Palich would later testify. Men were falling all around me. Lieutenant Virgil Larry felt a bullet strike his foot as he dove to the ground. He landed among a pile of fallen comrades, some dead, others moaning in pain. Warm blood seeped through the snow beneath him, creating a slush that began to freeze against his cheek. Harold Billow dropped to the ground as the machine gun fire swept over him. I inhaled and exhaled as little as possible, he would later recall, so they wouldn't see the steam from my breath. The initial machine gun barrage lasted approximately 1 minute. When it ceased, the field was littered with bodies. Those Americans still standing were cut down by another burst of fire. Some attempted to run and were shot in the back. A few managed to reach the nearby woods and escaped. But the horror was not yet complete. SS troops moved methodically through the field of fallen men. Following orders, they fired a pistol shot into the head of any American showing signs of life. The sound of these execution shots, methodical, unhurried, echoed across the snow-covered landscape. I could hear them walking among us, Palich would later testify. Their boots crunched in the snow. When they heard a wounded man groan, there would be a shot. Then silence. Homer Ford lay motionless, his face pressed into the bloody snow. Through slitted eyes, he watched SS troops moving among the bodies. They were laughing, he would later testify. They kicked bodies to see if anyone was alive, then shot them in the head. A group of wounded Americans tried to make a run for the woods. German machine guns opened fire again, cutting down most of them. A few reached the Café Boter Way and sought refuge inside. SS troops set the café ablaze, shooting any Americans who attempted to escape the flames. The massacre continued for approximately 15 minutes. When it was over, the SS troops returned to their vehicles and continued westward, leaving the field strewn with bodies of American soldiers, some dead, others grievously wounded and slowly freezing in the snow. The Baugnez Crossroads had become a field of death. 84 American soldiers lay dead or dying in the blood-stained snow. But remarkably, some survived. Men who would bear witness to one of the most notorious war crimes of the Western Front. December 17, 1944, 2 p.m. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. Corporal Ted Palich lay motionless in the blood-soaked snow. A bullet had grazed his right hand during the initial barrage, leaving a wound that bled freely, staining his uniform sleeve and the snow beneath him. Now he used this blood to his advantage, smearing it across his face to enhance the appearance of death. All around him lay his comrades, some dead, others like him, pretending. The moans of the severely wounded had mostly ceased, silenced by the methodical pistol shots of the SS executioners. Now an eerie quiet blanketed the field, broken only by the distant rumble of German vehicles, continuing their advance westward. Paluch hardly dared to breathe. Any visible exhalation in the frigid air would betray him with a telltale cloud of vapor. He breathed shallowly through his nose, his mouth pressed against the crook of his arm to hide any visible breath. "You wouldn't believe how little I inhaled and exhaled," Harold Billow would later recall, "so they wouldn't see the steam coming from my mouth." Minutes stretched into an eternity. Paluch could hear German voices nearby. An SS trooper walked within feet of him, boots crunching in the snow. Paluch kept his eyes closed to thin slits, enough to see without being seen. The German soldier paused, standing over a wounded American who had begun to stir. Without hesitation, the SS man fired a single shot into the wounded soldier's head. Warm blood spattered across the snow near Paluch's face. Homer Ford lay nearby, also feigning death. He would later testify about the casual manner in which the SS troops finished off the wounded. They were very methodical. They would kick a body, and if it moved or made a sound, they would shoot it in the head or hit it with their rifle butts. Lieutenant Virgil Larry had been wounded in the foot during the initial shooting. Despite the pain, he remained motionless as Germans moved among the bodies. He watched through barely open eyes as an SS trooper approached a severely wounded American medic who had been treating the injured before the massacre began. The medic looked up at his executioner with pleading eyes. The German shot him, point blank, in the face. The survivors lay among their dead comrades for what seemed an eternity, though in reality, it was approximately 2 hours. As the main body of Kampfgruppe Peiper moved westward, the immediate danger began to subside. Still, none dared move while German troops remained in the vicinity. The December sun, already low in the winter sky, cast lengthening shadows across the field of bodies. Temperature dropped further as afternoon waned toward evening. Blood froze on uniforms and in the snow. The survivors, forced to remain motionless, felt the bitter cold seeping through their clothes, threatening them with hypothermia. Some men, despite their best efforts, succumbed to their wounds or the cold while playing dead. Others found themselves in a nightmarish struggle to remain absolutely still, despite muscle cramps, the cold, and the psychological trauma of lying among the dead bodies of friends and comrades. As daylight began to fade around 4 p.m., the survivors faced a terrible choice. Remain in the field and risk freezing to death, or attempt to escape and risk being spotted by remaining German forces. Gradually, those who could move began to consider their options for escape and survival. Not just to save themselves, but to bear witness to the atrocity they had endured. December 17, 1944, 4:30 p.m. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. Dusk settled over the field of death. The rumble of German vehicles had faded, though occasional engine sounds could still be heard in the distance. For the survivors of the massacre, the time for decision had come. Ted Paluch had been listening intently for any sign of nearby German troops. After nearly 3 hours of lying motionless in the freezing cold, his limbs were numb and his wounded hand throbbed painfully. Cautiously raising his head just enough to look around, he saw no immediate signs of the enemy. The convoy of Kampfgruppe Peiper had moved on, though Paluch had no way of knowing if rearguard elements remained. Near him, other survivors began to stir. Some whispered to each other, voices barely audible. "Let's go," someone said softly. Paluch slowly, painfully, pushed himself up from the frozen ground. His joints screamed in protest after hours of immobility in the cold. Blood had frozen his uniform to the snow, and the fabric tore as he rose. All around him lay the bodies of his comrades, many in contorted positions, their blood staining the snow in dark patterns. Some had been shot multiple times by machine gun fire. Others bore the distinctive mark of an execution shot to the head. The scene was horrific beyond comprehension. I got up and I struggled for a while, rubbed my legs, Palick would later testify. Finally, I got to the point where I was half crawling and half running. Harold Billow rose shakily to his feet nearby. Like Palick, he had survived by playing dead throughout the massacre and its aftermath. Now he moved cautiously toward the tree line, ducking low to present the smallest possible silhouette against the twilight sky. Not all survivors fled immediately. Lieutenant Virgil Larry, wounded in the foot, waited until full darkness before attempting to move. His injury made silent movement impossible, and he feared detection by any Germans who might remain in the area. Some survivors helped each other. 2 men supported a third with a severe leg wound, half carrying him toward the wooded areas surrounding the killing field. Others crawled, dragging themselves through the blood-stained snow, leaving crimson trails behind them. The escape was not without peril. German sentries remained in the vicinity, and sporadic gunfire erupted as some fleeing Americans were spotted. Several men who had survived the initial massacre were killed during escape attempts. Palick and another survivor headed northwest, following the railroad tracks that would eventually lead back to Malmedy. They encountered a German soldier who spotted them and fired. The bullet missed Palick as he dove into a hedgerow where he lay still once more, employing the same technique that had saved him earlier. The Germans searched briefly, then abandoned the pursuit. Other survivors scattered in different directions. Some sought refuge in Belgian farmhouses, where civilians hid them despite the risk of reprisal. Others found their way to the woods, where they huddled together for warmth during the bitter night, afraid to light fires that might attract enemy attention. By 6 p.m., the first survivors began reaching American lines around Malmedy. A patrol from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion encountered several bloodied, half-frozen men stumbling through the darkness. The Americans were initially suspicious, as intelligence had reported German infiltrators wearing American uniforms. I had to explain different things about baseball teams and everything else before they'd figure out I was an American, one survivor recalled. Because there were Germans in American uniforms out there. Once their identities were confirmed, the survivors were rushed to aid stations. There, as medical personnel treated their physical wounds, they began to tell their story. A tale of atrocity that would shock the Allied command and alter the course of the Battle of the Bulge. December 17, 1944, 7 p.m., Malmedy, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, listened in stunned disbelief as the survivors recounted the massacre. The engineers of his battalion had been constructing defensive positions around Malmedy when the first survivors appeared. Bloodied, exhausted men with haunted eyes and tales of systematic execution. SS troops vicinity L8199 captured U.S. soldiers. Traffic MP. With about 200 U.S. soldiers, Pergrin wrote in his initial report. American prisoners searched. When finished, Germans lined up Americans and shot them with machine pistols and machine guns. Wounded informant who escaped, and more details follow later. Pergrin immediately dispatched the report to 1st U.S. Army headquarters. Within hours, the information had reached General Courtney Hodges, commander of the 1st Army, who authorized its immediate release to the press. His Chief of Staff, Major General William Keane, wrote, "There is absolutely no question as to its proof. Immediate publicity is being given to the story." The news of the Malmedy Massacre spread rapidly through American forces. As more survivors reached safety, a clearer picture of the atrocity emerged. Homer Ford, the military policeman who had witnessed the methodical killing of wounded Americans, provided particularly detailed testimony. He described hearing the American wounded moaning and crying and watching the Germans either shoot them or hit them with the butts of their guns. Ted Palak and Harold Billow, among the first survivors to reach American lines, were debriefed extensively by intelligence officers. Despite their exhaustion and the psychological trauma they had endured, they provided crucial details that helped identify the perpetrators as elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. The response among American troops was immediate and visceral. Rage swept through the ranks, hardening resolve at a critical moment when the German offensive had thrown Allied forces into disarray. Units that might have retreated further in the face of the German onslaught now determined to stand and fight. It was an inspiration, a terrible inspiration, one American officer later wrote. The story of the massacre spread quickly through the lines, and our men were fired with a new determination not to give ground. Unofficial orders began to circulate among American units. No SS troops were to be taken prisoner. While official policy still demanded adherence to the Geneva Conventions, the reality on the ground shifted. American soldiers who might have accepted enemy surrenders now became more likely to shoot first. The massacre transformed the Battle of the Bulge from a military engagement into something more personal and primal. For many American soldiers, it was no longer just about strategic objectives. It was about justice, vengeance, and stopping an enemy capable of such barbarism. At the highest levels of Allied command, the news prompted re-evaluation of the German offensive's nature. General Eisenhower and his staff had initially been caught off guard by the scale and ferocity of the German attack. Now, the Malmedy Massacre suggested that this was not merely a military operation, but part of a broader campaign of terror and intimidation. Intelligence analysts connected the massacre to reports of other atrocities committed by Kampfgruppe Peiper during its advance. In Beulingen, Ligneurville, and other Belgian villages, SS troops had summarily executed both American prisoners and Belgian civilians suspected of aiding the Allies. A pattern emerged. Hitler had ordered his forces to wage a campaign of unprecedented brutality on the Western Front, importing the savage tactics previously reserved for the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. The Führer believed that shock and terror might break Allied morale and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to focus entirely on the Soviet threat. By midnight on December 17th, as Ted Palak and other survivors received medical treatment for their wounds and exposure, the story of the Malmedy Massacre had reached the highest levels of the Allied command. It would soon reach the American public as well, galvanizing home front support for the desperate battle unfolding in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. The massacre at Baugnez crossroads, which would forever be associated with the nearby town of Malmedy, had transformed from an isolated atrocity into a pivotal moment in the Battle of the Bulge, and in the broader history of World War II in Europe. December 17th through 18th, 1944. Night. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. While the first survivors reached American lines and raised the alarm, others remained hidden in the frozen Ardennes landscape, fighting for survival through the bitter night. Lieutenant Virgil Larry had waited until full darkness before attempting to leave the killing field. His wounded foot made walking difficult and painfully slow. Unable to follow the faster escapees, he found himself alone in the frozen forest as temperatures plummeted well below freezing. "I couldn't feel my feet anymore," he would later testify. "The wound had stopped bleeding, but the pain was terrible. I knew if I stopped moving, I would freeze to death." Larry oriented himself by the stars, moving northwest toward what he hoped were American lines. Each step in the deep snow was agony. Twice he heard German patrols and hid, pressing himself into snowbanks until they passed. By midnight, exhaustion and blood loss threatened to overwhelm him. He found a hollow beneath a fallen tree and curled into it, using branches and snow for insulation against the killing cold. Other survivors faced similar struggles. 2 soldiers, their names lost to history, but their ordeal documented by those they eventually rejoined, hid in a Belgian farmer's hayloft. The farmer, risking execution if discovered harboring Americans, brought them blankets and hot soup. His 10-year-old daughter stood watch at the road, ready to alert them if German patrols approached. Some survivors never made it to safety. Their bodies were found weeks later, frozen in the snow, sometimes just a few hundred yards from American lines. They had survived the massacre only to succumb to their wounds, exposure, or German patrols during escape attempts. For those still in hiding, the night of December 17 through 18 was interminable. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind whistled through the Ardennes forest, driving snow and creating deadly wind chill. Men with wet clothing from lying in the snow were particularly vulnerable to hypothermia. One group of 3 survivors huddled together in a drainage ditch, sharing body heat to stay alive. They had a single chocolate bar from a K-ration between them. They broke it into 3 pieces and rationed it through the night, along with handfuls of snow for hydration. None spoke of what they had witnessed at the crossroads. The shared trauma was too immediate, too raw for words. Meanwhile, at American aid stations and field hospitals, medical personnel worked to save those survivors who had reached safety. Many suffered from combinations of gunshot wounds, extreme cold exposure, and psychological trauma. Doctors noted the 1,000-yard stares of men who had lain among their dead comrades, playing dead while executioners moved among them. These men have seen the worst humanity has to offer, one Army physician wrote in his report. Their physical wounds may heal, but I question whether they will ever fully recover from what they witnessed. Ted Palak, after receiving treatment for his wounded hand and beginning to recover from exposure, was unable to sleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the execution of the American medic who had been treating wounded soldiers when the shooting began. I kept seeing his face, Palak would later recall. The way he looked up at the German who shot him. I don't think I'll ever forget that as long as I live. Harold Billow, physically uninjured but severely traumatized, sat wrapped in blankets, staring at the wall of the aid station. When a nurse brought him hot coffee, his hands shook so violently that he could not hold the cup. The nurse had to help him drink. Throughout that long night, as survivors struggled with their physical and psychological wounds, news of the massacre continued to spread through American forces in the Ardennes. By dawn on December 18th, the story had reached most frontline units facing Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. The night that had seemed endless to the survivors finally gave way to a gray dawn. For those still hiding in the frozen landscape, it brought the hope of rescue, but also increased danger of discovery. For those who had reached safety, it brought the beginning of recovery, but also the weight of bearing witness to what would soon be recognized as one of the most notorious war crimes of the Western Front. The Malmedy Massacre had occurred just hours before, but already it was transforming from an event into a symbol, one that would have profound implications for the battle still raging in the snow-covered hills and forests of the Ardennes. December 18, 1944. Morning. Western Ardennes, Belgium. While survivors of the massacre struggled through the bitter night, Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its relentless push westward. The battle group had advanced nearly 20 miles since crossing the American lines, leaving a trail of destruction and atrocities in its wake. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper drove his men mercilessly forward. A fanatic Nazi and veteran of the brutal Eastern Front campaigns, Peiper had been personally tasked by Hitler to spearhead the offensive. His objective was the Meuse River crossings near Huy, from which his armored units could strike toward the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied forces. At 29 years old, Peiper was already notorious for his ruthlessness. He had served as Heinrich Himmler's adjutant before taking combat command, and had absorbed the SS ideology of racial superiority and merciless treatment of enemies. On the Eastern Front, his unit had earned a reputation for brutality against Soviet troops and civilians. Now he had brought these methods to the Western Front, in accordance with Hitler's directive that the offensive be conducted with unprecedented ferocity to break Allied morale. The massacre at Baugnez crossroads was not an isolated incident. As Kampfgruppe Peiper progressed, similar atrocities occurred along its route. In Ligneuville, American prisoners were executed. In Stavelot, Belgian civilians, suspected of aiding Allied forces, were summarily shot. However, the German advance was meeting increasing resistance. American forces, initially taken by surprise by the offensive, were regrouping. The news of the Malmedy Massacre had hardened resolve among American troops and commanders alike. Near Stavelot, soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division and 3rd Armored Division were preparing defenses and demolishing bridges to block Peiper's route. Crucially, they destroyed a fuel depot that Peiper had hoped to capture to resupply his fuel-hungry tanks and half-tracks. Peiper's 19,000-man battle group, overextended and increasingly short of fuel, found itself in a precarious position. The narrow Ardennes roads, intended for the swift passage of armor, now became a liability as American resistance stiffened and the German supply lines stretched thin. Unknown to Peiper, his forces were now the primary target of Allied air and ground assets. The massacre at Malmedy had elevated Kampfgruppe Peiper from one of several German units to the embodiment of Nazi brutality, a force that had to be stopped at all costs. Find Peiper. Destroy Peiper. This order echoed through American command channels as reinforcements poured into the Ardennes. The weather, which had initially favored the German offensive by grounding Allied air support, began to clear. Soon, American fighter bombers would join the hunt for the SS battle group. At the same time, news of the Malmedy Massacre had reached Belgian civilians in the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. Despite the risk of reprisals, many chose to aid Allied forces by providing intelligence on German movements. Others helped American soldiers evade capture or hid survivors of various engagements. This civilian resistance further complicated Peiper's advance. His battle group, designed for rapid breakthrough and exploitation, was increasingly bogged down in hostile territory, with dwindling supplies and multiplying enemies. By the evening of December 18, Kampfgruppe Peiper had stalled near Le Glaise and Stumal. Fuel shortages, destroyed bridges, and stiffening American resistance had brought the once fearsome spearhead to a halt. The battle group that had seemed unstoppable just 24 hours earlier now faced encirclement and destruction. Peiper's men dug in, creating defensive positions among the stone buildings of the Belgian villages they occupied. Their commander sent increasingly desperate messages to German headquarters, requesting resupply and reinforcement. Neither would arrive in sufficient quantity. The hunters had become the hunted. The perpetrators of the Malmedy Massacre would soon face the consequences of their actions, not just in the immediate battle, but in the larger judgment of history and international law. December 18 through 20th, 1944. 1st Army Headquarters, Spa, Belgium. The survivors of the Malmedy Massacre became the center of intense interest at the highest levels of Allied command. Those physically able to speak were debriefed extensively by military intelligence officers, their testimonies forming a comprehensive picture of the atrocity and the unit responsible for it. Ted Palak, his wounded hand bandaged, sat across from a major from the Judge Advocate General's office. Despite his exhaustion, Palak recounted the events in detail: the brief battle, the surrender, the initial shot that served as a signal, and the methodical machine gunning of unarmed prisoners. The officer stood on the tank, Palak testified. He fired one shot, hit one guy on my right side, then another guy on my left side. This medic was fixing a guy up. Then everybody started shooting. Harold Billow described how he had survived by playing dead, controlling his breathing to prevent visible vapor in the cold air. They came around and anybody that was alive, that was wounded, they would shoot them in the head, or they would hit them with the butt of a rifle, he reported. Lieutenant Virgil Larry, rescued on the morning of December 18th after spending the night hiding in the forest, provided crucial testimony about the organized nature of the execution. Despite his weakened condition from blood loss and frostbite, Larry insisted on giving his account immediately. This wasn't the heat of battle, he stated firmly. We had surrendered. We were disarmed. They lined us up in that field deliberately, and the shooting was coordinated. The officer fired that first shot as a signal. Homer Ford, the military policeman, corroborated these accounts. His testimony was particularly damning regarding the systematic killing of the wounded. I could hear our wounded men moaning and crying, he told investigators. The Germans walked among them. When they found someone still alive, they would either shoot them or hit them with their rifle butts. Military intelligence officers cross-referenced the survivors' accounts, noting the remarkable consistency in details despite the men having been separated after their escape. The testimonies converged on a clear narrative of premeditated mass execution, a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. The investigators were particularly interested in identifying the specific unit responsible. Survivors consistently described seeing the distinctive double lightning bolt SS runes on the collars and helmets of their captors. Several mentioned hearing the name 1st SS spoken by German officers who spoke English. This intelligence, combined with other battlefield reports, confirmed that the perpetrators were elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's former bodyguard unit and one of the most fanatical formations in the Waffen-SS. The survivors' testimony was quickly forwarded up the chain of command. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was briefed personally. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, received a comprehensive report by December 20th. The survivors' accounts had a profound impact on the Allied leadership. What might have been dismissed as the fog of war or the regrettable excesses of combat was revealed through their testimony as a deliberate, systematic war crime. Eisenhower authorized the immediate release of the survivors' accounts to Western media. The decision reflected both moral outrage and strategic calculation. The atrocity would stiffen Allied resolve and erode any remaining sympathy for Germany in neutral countries. For the survivors themselves, giving testimony brought little comfort. Many found themselves wrestling with guilt for having survived when so many of their comrades had not. Others experienced recurring nightmares and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite their physical and psychological trauma, many of the survivors insisted on returning to duty. The war was far from over, and they felt compelled to see it through. Now not just for their country, but for the memory of their massacred comrades. "I want to go back," Ted Palich told a doctor who suggested he might be sent home to recover. "I need to finish this." The survivors had escaped the field of death at Baugnez crossroads, but they would carry the memory of that blood-soaked snow with them forever. Their testimony ensured that what happened there would not be forgotten or minimized, that the men who died would receive justice, if not in the immediate battle, then in the judgment of history. December 19th through 24, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Find Peiper. Destroy Peiper. This directive permeated all levels of the Allied command as the Battle of the Bulge intensified. Kampfgruppe Peiper, once the spearhead of the German offensive, had become the primary target for American forces in the northern sector of the Bulge. The weather, which had hampered Allied air operations during the initial stages of the German offensive, began to clear on December 23rd. American P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons took to the skies, hunting for Peiper's tanks and half-tracks among the snow-covered forests and villages of the Ardennes. On the ground, elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the 3rd Armored Division, and the 82nd Airborne Division converged on the area where intelligence indicated Peiper's battle group was stalled. Fuel shortages and destroyed bridges had tracked the once mobile force in the vicinity of Le Glaise and Stoumont. The hunt for Peiper was intensified by the spreading news of the Malmedy Massacre. American soldiers who might have accepted surrenders from regular Wehrmacht troops now approached SS units with a very different mindset. While official policy still demanded adherence to the laws of war, the reality on the ground was more complex. "The word was out," one American officer later wrote. "No quarter for SS. They had chosen the rules of engagement at Malmedy." Surrounded, low on fuel and ammunition, and subjected to constant air and artillery bombardment, Kampfgruppe Peiper found itself in an increasingly desperate situation. Peiper's requests for resupply and reinforcement went largely unanswered, as the broader German offensive began to lose momentum against stiffening Allied resistance. By December 24th, Peiper made the decision to abandon his vehicles and attempt to break out on foot. Under cover of darkness, approximately 800 surviving members of his original 5,000-man battle group slipped through American lines, leaving behind their tanks, half-tracks, and heavy weapons. They also left behind evidence. American troops entering Le Glaise discovered abandoned vehicles bearing the distinctive markings of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Documents recovered from command vehicles provided further confirmation of the unit's identity and chain of command. Most damningly, they found bodies, American prisoners and Belgian civilians who had been executed in the same manner as the victims at Malmedy. The pattern of atrocity was clear and consistent, pointing directly to a policy of systematic execution rather than isolated incidents. Meanwhile, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, plans were already being formulated for the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the Malmedy Massacre. General Eisenhower directed that a special team be assembled from the Judge Advocate General's Office, Military Intelligence, and the Criminal Investigation Division, CID, of the Military Police. This team was tasked with gathering evidence, identifying specific perpetrators, and building what would eventually become the case for the Malmedy Massacre trial. Their work began even as the Battle of the Bulge continued to rage, demonstrating the Allies' commitment to bringing the perpetrators to justice. By Christmas Day 1944, the immediate threat posed by Kampfgruppe Peiper had been eliminated. The battle group's destruction marked a significant turning point in the northern sector of the German offensive. With its spearhead broken, the 6th SS Panzer Army lost momentum and began to fall back in the face of mounting Allied counterattacks. For the survivors of the Malmedy Massacre, the news that Peiper's force had been defeated brought a measure of grim satisfaction. The unit that had executed their comrades in the snow-covered field at Baugnez crossroads had itself been destroyed as a fighting force. But true justice would require more than battlefield victory. It would demand formal accountability for what survivor Virgil Larry called a calculated act of mass murder. That accountability would come, though not until after the war's end, and not without controversy. January 13th through 15th, 1945, Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. The battle lines had shifted. American forces had regained control of the Malmedy area, pushing the Germans back toward their original positions. The desperate German gamble in the Ardennes had failed, though fighting continued along the shrinking perimeter of the Bulge. On January 13, 1945, nearly a month after the massacre, a grim task force arrived at the Baugnez crossroads. It consisted of investigators from the U.S. First Army's Inspector General's Office, medical officers, photographers, and the 4th Platoon of the 3060th Quartermaster Graves Registration Service Company. Their mission? To recover and identify the bodies of the Malmedy Massacre victims and to document evidence for future war crimes proceedings. What they found was a scene of horror preserved by the winter cold. The bodies lay where they had fallen, now covered by deep snow that had accumulated through several winter storms. Temperatures had remained below freezing since the massacre, effectively preserving the crime scene in a macabre tableau. The recovery team worked methodically. First, they photographed the scene from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive visual record of how and where the bodies lay. Then they began the painstaking process of clearing snow from around each victim. As bodies were uncovered, their positions told the story of the massacre with heartbreaking clarity. Some lay in neat rows, cut down by the initial machine gun barrage. Others were found in postures of desperate flight, shot in the back while attempting to escape. Perhaps most disturbing were those found with their hands still raised in surrender. It was like they were frozen in time, one Graves registration soldier later recalled. You could see exactly how it happened, preserved in the snow and ice. The medical officers conducted field autopsies, documenting wounds with clinical precision. Their findings confirmed the survivors' accounts. Many victims bore multiple machine gun wounds to their bodies. 41 had been shot in the head at close range. evidence of the methodical execution of the wounded. 10 others had their skulls crushed by rifle butts. Each body was assigned a number, and its position carefully mapped. Identification was accomplished through dog tags, personal effects, and fingerprints. In some cases, the grave's registration personnel had to inject water into the frozen fingertips of corpses with hypodermic needles to make the skin pliable enough for printing. The recovery operation took 3 days. In total, 72 bodies were found in the main killing field. Additional victims were discovered in the woods nearby, shot while attempting to escape. Others were found in and around the burned remains of the Café WWII. Snow had fallen several times since the massacre, and a fresh snowfall covered the bodies, read the official report. Temperatures had hovered below freezing, and the Germans had made no attempt to bury the bodies. These factors combined to keep the remains remarkably preserved. The preserved condition of the victims allowed forensic experts to establish a clear timeline and sequence of events. Bullet trajectories, blood patterns, and the positions of bodies all corroborated what survivors had reported. This was no confused battlefield incident, but a deliberate, organized mass execution. Most poignantly, personal effects recovered from the bodies humanized the victims. Letters from home, photographs of wives and children, religious medals, and other intimate items were carefully cataloged. These would later be returned to families, along with the terrible knowledge of how their loved ones had died. By January 15, the recovery operation was complete. The bodies of the Malmedy victims were transferred to American military cemeteries. The evidence gathered at the site, photographs, autopsy reports, maps, and recovered German items, was secured for eventual use in war crimes proceedings. The frozen field had yielded its testimony. Combined with the accounts of survivors, it formed an irrefutable case against those responsible. The Malmedy Massacre was established beyond doubt as one of the most clearly documented war crimes of the Western Front. For the graves registration personnel, military police, and medical officers who conducted the recovery operation, the experience left indelible memories. Many would later serve as witnesses in the war crimes trials, describing in clinical detail the evidence of atrocity they had uncovered in that snow-covered field. Their work ensured that the men who died at Baugnez crossroads would not be forgotten. The frozen testimony they recovered would speak for the dead when the time came for justice. January-April 1945. European Theater of Operations. While investigators documented the Malmedy atrocity and prepared for eventual war crimes proceedings, the war in Europe ground toward its bloody conclusion. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945 with a decisive Allied victory, eliminating the last significant German offensive capability in the West. For the survivors of the Malmedy Massacre, the war continued as well. Despite their traumatic experiences, many returned to active duty after recovering from their physical wounds. The psychological trauma they carried was less visible, but perhaps more enduring. Ted Palak rejoined a reconstituted unit in February 1945, determined to see the war through to its end. "After what I saw at Malmedy," he later said, "I couldn't go home until it was finished." Harold Billow, similarly, returned to duty. Like many survivors, he found that keeping busy helped manage the intrusive memories and nightmares that plagued him. "I just sort of let it go," he would later recall. "Just let it go. But sometimes I couldn't sleep at all, and all I could picture was everything happening right in front of me." The surviving members of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were dispersed to other units, the battalion having suffered too many casualties to be reconstituted effectively. This separation added another layer of loss for men who had already endured unimaginable trauma. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945, evidence of Nazi atrocities multiplied. The liberation of concentration camps revealed the full extent of the Third Reich's crimes against humanity. In this broader context of horror, the Malmedy Massacre was recognized as part of a systematic pattern rather than an isolated incident. The hunt for those responsible continued even as the fighting raged. Military intelligence units compiled lists of SS personnel associated with Kampfgruppe Peiper. As German territory fell to Allied forces, these men became the subjects of specific search operations. Joachim Peiper himself remained a primary target. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, he had been transferred to command an SS unit fighting on the Eastern Front. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, he moved westward, preferring to surrender to American forces rather than face capture by the Soviets. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over, though pockets of resistance remained in some areas. For the survivors of Malmedy, the news brought mixed emotions. Relief that the fighting had ended, but also a renewed focus on bringing the perpetrators to justice. Throughout the summer of 1945, Allied occupation forces in Germany conducted systematic searches for SS personnel. Using lists compiled by military intelligence, they sought those connected to the 1st SS Panzer Division in general, and Kampfgruppe Peiper specifically. By September 1945, approximately 400 former members of the unit had been detained at a prison camp in Schwäbisch Hall, near Stuttgart. Among them was Joachim Peiper himself, captured while trying to make his way to Austria. For the next several months, U.S. Army war crimes investigators interrogated these prisoners, building their case for what would become the Malmedy Massacre trial. Their methods would later become a subject of controversy, with allegations of physical coercion and procedural irregularities. Meanwhile, the survivors of the massacre continued their own journeys. Some remained in Europe with occupation forces. Others returned to the United States, where they attempted to rebuild their lives and process their experiences. For many, the end of the war brought little peace. The memories of that snow-covered field at Baugnez crossroads, the methodical gunfire, the moans of the wounded, the execution shots, remained vivid and intrusive. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder affected many survivors, though in the 1940s, such psychological injuries were poorly understood and often minimized. Every once in a while it comes back to me, one survivor would later testify. I see everything that went on. It's always difficult to see the bodies in the field. The war had ended, but for the survivors and for the families of those killed at Malmedy, a different kind of struggle continued. One for justice, for remembrance, and for some measure of healing from wounds that went far deeper than flesh and bone. May-July 1946, Dachau concentration camp, Germany. On May 16, 1946, in a courtroom improvised from a building at the former Dachau concentration camp, the Malmedy Massacre trial began. 74 defendants, including Joachim Peiper and other officers and men of the 1st SS Panzer Division, faced charges of violation of the laws and usages of war through the deliberate killing of captured American soldiers and Belgian civilians. The choice of venue was deliberately symbolic. Dachau had been the first Nazi concentration camp, established in 1933, and the site of countless atrocities. Now it served as the location for a series of war crimes trials, the accused facing justice in a place that epitomized the regime they had served. The American military tribunal consisted of 8 senior officers, headed by Brigadier General Josiah T. Dalby. The chief prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel Burton F. Ellis, had spent months preparing the case with a team of investigators and legal experts. The prosecution's case rested on 3 main pillars: testimony from survivors of the massacre, forensic evidence recovered from the killing field, and confessions obtained from the defendants during pretrial interrogations. Their argument was that the killings at Malmedy and other locations were not the heat of battle excesses of individual soldiers, but the result of a deliberate policy, originating with Hitler himself, to conduct the Ardennes offensive with unprecedented brutality. 7 survivors of the Malmedy Massacre testified in person, recounting the events of December 17, 1944, in harrowing detail. Ted Palak, Harold Billow, Virgil Larry, and Homer Ford were among those who faced their former captors across the courtroom, describing the systematic execution of unarmed prisoners. "I saw an officer stand up on the tank," Palick testified. "He took one shot and shot the guy to the right of me. Then he shot the guy to the left of me." Homer Ford described the methodical killing of the wounded. "They were walking among us. Whenever they would hear an American wounded moaning or crying, they would either shoot them or hit them with the butts of their guns." The prosecution also presented photographs and forensic evidence from the January 1945 recovery operation at Baugnez crossroads. Medical officers who had conducted autopsies on the victims testified about execution-style gunshot wounds to the head and other evidence consistent with the survivors' accounts. Perhaps most damning were the confessions and statements obtained from the defendants themselves. Several SS men had provided detailed accounts of the massacre, some implicating their comrades and superior officers. These confessions painted a picture of systematic brutality authorized at the highest levels. The defense, led by Colonel Willis M. Everett, Jr., an American lawyer appointed to represent the accused, faced a daunting task. Their strategy focused on three main arguments: challenging the credibility of the confessions, portraying the killings as the result of combat confusion rather than deliberate policy, and highlighting the good treatment received by other American prisoners captured by Kampfgruppe Peiper. Joachim Peiper himself testified, denying direct responsibility for the killings while acknowledging that they had occurred. He claimed not to have been present at the Baugnez crossroads during the massacre, and suggested that subordinates had acted without his knowledge or approval. The defense also presented testimony from Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. McCown, an American officer captured by Peiper's unit, who had been treated correctly. This testimony was meant to counter the prosecution's argument that the SS had a policy of executing all prisoners. Most controversially, the defense alleged that the confessions had been obtained through coercion, including physical abuse and threats. They claimed that American interrogators had used mock trials, false witnesses, and other deceptive tactics to extract statements from the defendants. These allegations would later become a focal point of controversy, leading to Senate hearings and a re-evaluation of the sentences. At the time, however, the tribunal largely dismissed them, finding the evidence of guilt overwhelming. After weeks of testimony, the tribunal reached its verdict on July 16, 1946. All 74 defendants were found guilty. 43, including Joachim Peiper, were sentenced to death by hanging. Others received life imprisonment or lengthy prison terms. The verdict and sentences reflected the gravity of the crime and the clear evidence of the defendants' guilt. However, the Malmedy Massacre trial would not be the final chapter in the legal aftermath of the atrocity. Appeals, controversies, and Cold War politics would all play a role in what happened next. For the survivors who had testified, the guilty verdicts brought a measure of vindication but little comfort. The memories of that blood-soaked field could not be erased by any legal proceeding, no matter how thorough or just. "I testified through a written testimony," one survivor later recalled. The suicide of Adolf Hitler in late April of 1945 and the unconditional surrender of German forces a week later did not bring closure to the 50 survivors of the infamous Malmedy Massacre. The trial had established legal accountability, but personal healing would prove a longer, more complex journey. 1947 to 1956, United States and West Germany. The death sentences handed down in the Malmedy Massacre trial ignited an unexpected controversy that would span nearly a decade and eventually become entangled with Cold War politics. Shortly after the verdicts were announced, the defense counsel, Colonel Willis M. Everett, Jr., began raising serious concerns about the conduct of the pretrial investigations. Everett, originally skeptical of his client's claims of mistreatment, had become convinced that procedural irregularities and possibly coercive interrogation techniques had tainted the process. In October 1947, Everett submitted a petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, seeking a writ of habeas corpus for the condemned men. While the court declined to hear the case on jurisdictional grounds, Everett's allegations gained traction in other forums. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the Vatican both requested clemency for the condemned men. More significantly, a commission led by Judge Gordon Simpson of Texas was appointed to review the trial procedures. The Simpson Commission identified various irregularities in the pretrial interrogations, but concluded that the defendants had received a fundamentally fair trial. However, the controversy escalated dramatically when the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, under pressure from various sources, established a subcommittee in 1949 to investigate the allegations. Led by Senator Raymond E. Baldwin, the subcommittee conducted hearings that became increasingly contentious. Former interrogators defended their techniques as necessary and appropriate, while critics characterized them as coercive and inconsistent with American principles of justice. The Baldwin subcommittee ultimately issued a report critical of some aspects of the investigation, while stopping short of invalidating the trial's conclusions. Throughout this period, the executions were repeatedly delayed as the reviews continued. By 1951, in the context of the escalating Cold War and the need for West German support against the Soviet threat, political considerations began to influence the case. The emerging Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, had become an important Cold War ally. German public opinion, while acknowledging Nazi crimes, had become increasingly critical of what many Germans perceived as victors' justice. The Malmedy case became a focal point for these sentiments, particularly as allegations of procedural improprieties gained publicity. In 1951, General Thomas T. Handy, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, commuted all but 7 of the death sentences to life imprisonment. The following year, the remaining death sentences, including Peiper's, were also commuted. By 1954, the political pressure for reconciliation with West Germany led to further reductions in sentences. Many of the convicted SS men were released under a clemency program. Peiper himself was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956, having served just over 11 years of his life sentence. For survivors of the massacre and the families of the victims, these developments were deeply painful. They watched as the men responsible for the killing of 84 unarmed American prisoners received what many perceived as lenient treatment due to political expediency. It was a betrayal, one survivor later said. Those men murdered our comrades in cold blood, and then they walked free because they were suddenly useful in the fight against communism. The survivors themselves received little official recognition or support during this period. Many struggled with what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, but mental health resources for veterans were limited in the 1940s and 1950s. Some found solace in veterans organizations or private support networks. Others suffered in isolation. Ted Palich returned to Philadelphia after the war and worked for General Electric for 40 years, rarely speaking about his experiences at Malmedy. Harold Billow went back to Pennsylvania and became a truck driver. Both men carried the memories of that blood-soaked field with them, haunted by images of comrades who never came home. The controversies surrounding the trial and the subsequent commutations of sentences illustrated the complex intersection of justice, politics, and memory in the aftermath of war crimes. While the factual reality of the massacre itself was never seriously disputed, the evidence was too overwhelming. The question of how justice should be administered became entangled with broader geopolitical considerations. For the survivors and the families of those killed, no legal proceeding could fully address the profound loss and trauma they had experienced. The Malmedy Massacre remained a wound that never fully healed, a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the complex, often unsatisfying nature of justice in its aftermath. 1956 to 2015. United States, Belgium, and Germany. The shadow of the Malmedy Massacre stretched across decades, affecting the lives of survivors, perpetrators, and the collective memory of three nations in profoundly different ways. For Joachim Peiper, release from prison did not bring freedom from his past. Unable to reintegrate into German society, where his SS background made him unwelcome in many circles, he eventually relocated to a small village in eastern France in the early 1970s, living under a pseudonym. His anonymity proved short-lived. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day in France, his house was burned to the ground. Peiper's charred body was found in the ruins, a weapon nearby. Though the perpetrators were never identified, it was widely believed that French resistance veterans or communist activists had discovered his identity and exacted their own form of justice, 31 years after the end of the war. For survivors like Ted Palak and Harold Billow, life continued, but the memories never faded. Both men returned to their hometowns, built careers, and raised families. Like many of their generation, they initially spoke little about their wartime experiences. "It wasn't easy to talk about," Billow later said. "I just sort of let it go. Just let it go." But the silence eventually gave way to a recognition of the importance of bearing witness. As they aged, many survivors began sharing their stories, with family members, in recorded oral histories, and at commemorative events. Palak, who had been wounded in the hand during the massacre, became more vocal about his experiences in his later years. He participated in documentaries and gave interviews, ensuring that the atrocity would not be forgotten as the World War II generation dwindled. "I survived because I had the good Lord with me," he often said, attributing his escape to divine intervention rather than chance. In Belgium, the massacre site at the Baugnez crossroads became a place of solemn remembrance. In July 1950, a formal memorial replaced the wooden cross that had initially marked the location. The Baugnez 44 Historical Center later opened nearby, documenting the massacre and the broader context of the Battle of the Bulge. The memorial wall at Baugnez holds 84 flat stones, each bearing the name of a soldier killed in the massacre. A single stone nearby reads, "To the memory of the soldiers of the United States Army who, while prisoners of war, were massacred by Nazi troops on this spot on 17th December, 1944. Every year on the anniversary of the massacre, ceremonies are held at the memorial. Belgian citizens place flowers and light candles, maintaining a tradition of remembrance across generations. For many Belgians, especially in the Malmedy region, the massacre symbolizes both the brutality of occupation and the sacrifice of those who liberated their country. In the United States, the Malmedy Massacre gradually faded from public consciousness as the war receded into history, though it remained significant in military and historical circles. The controversy over the trial and its aftermath occasionally resurged in academic discussions and legal analyses, often cited in debates about military justice and the handling of war crimes. For the families of the 84 men killed, the passage of time brought little comfort. Gold Star mothers and fathers went to their graves still mourning sons who had died not in combat, but in an act of calculated brutality. Widows raised children who would never know their fathers. Siblings carried the loss of brothers throughout their lives. As the decades passed, the number of living survivors steadily diminished. Those who remained continued to age, their ranks thinning with each passing year. By the early 21st century, only a handful were still alive to tell their stories firsthand. Ted Palak passed away on August 8, 2015, at the age of 92. His obituary noted his survival of the massacre as a defining aspect of his long life. "He was the luckiest, unlucky man I ever met," his son said. "Unlucky to be in that situation, but lucky enough to survive it." Harold Billow, one of the last known survivors, continued to share his story well into his 90s, speaking to schools, veterans groups, and historical societies. "I want people to know what happened," he explained. "It's important that they remember." In 2022, Harold Billow, the last known survivor of the Malmedy Massacre, passed away at age 99. The atrocity at Malmedy thus moved from lived experience to historical memory, a transition that inevitably alters how events are understood and remembered. Yet, through the testimonies of survivors, the meticulous work of investigators, and the efforts of those committed to remembrance, the essential truth of what happened in that snow-covered field has been preserved. The 84 American soldiers who died at the Baugnez crossroads on December 17, 1944, remain a testament to the human cost of war and the importance of upholding the laws and conventions that govern armed conflict, even in its darkest moments. The Malmedy Massacre, now nearly 8 decades in the past, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented war crimes of the Second World War. The evidence, survivor testimony, forensic findings, German confessions, and contemporary records leaves no room for legitimate doubt about what happened in that snow-covered field at the Baugnez crossroads. On December 17, 1944, members of Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division deliberately and systematically executed 84 unarmed American prisoners of war who had surrendered after a brief battle. The killing was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence or the excess of individual soldiers, but an organized atrocity consistent with directives for ruthlessness that had flowed from Hitler himself. The massacre was not an isolated incident. Similar killings of American prisoners and Belgian civilians occurred along the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. Together, these atrocities formed a pattern of criminal conduct that reflected the Nazi regime's willingness to violate the most fundamental laws of war in pursuit of victory. What distinguishes the Malmedy Massacre in historical memory is not just its scale or brutality, but the fact that a significant number of victims survived to bear witness. Men like Ted Palich, Harold Billow, Virgil Larry, and Homer Ford, who played dead in the blood-soaked snow, endured the killing of wounded comrades, and escaped through the frozen Ardennes landscape, ensured that the truth would be known and the perpetrators held accountable. The legal aftermath of the massacre, the trial, controversies, and eventual commutation of sentences reflects the complex intersection of justice, politics, and geopolitical reality in the post-war era. While the factual record of the atrocity remained clear, the quest for accountability became entangled with Cold War imperatives and the rehabilitation of West Germany as an ally against the Soviet threat. For survivors, the psychological impact of the massacre endured long after the physical wounds had healed. Many carried the memories of that day throughout their lives. The sudden crack of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, the methodical execution shots, the long hours of lying motionless among dead comrades, and the desperate escape through the frozen forest. Every once in a while it comes back to me, one survivor reflected decades later. I see everything that went on. It's always difficult to see the bodies in the field. Today, the memorial at the Baugnez crossroads stands as a solemn reminder of the 84 American soldiers who died there. Men who had surrendered honorably and expected the protections guaranteed to prisoners of war under international law. Their names, etched in stone, represent not just individual lives cut short, but the broader principle that even in war's darkest moments, certain fundamental rules of humanity must be observed. The story of the Malmedy Massacre is ultimately about both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of those who survive it. It reminds us that behind the strategic maps and historical analyses of the Battle of the Bulge were individual human beings. Young men far from home, caught in the machinery of global conflict, facing moments of extraordinary moral testing. Some, like the SS troops who methodically executed unarmed prisoners, failed that test in the most profound way possible. Others, like the survivors who played dead in the snow and later testified to what they had witnessed, demonstrated remarkable courage and fortitude in the face of unspeakable horror. As the generation that experienced World War II firsthand passes from the scene, The responsibility for remembering and understanding events like the Malmedy Massacre falls to subsequent generations. The facts have been established beyond reasonable doubt. The challenge now is to preserve not just the historical record, but the moral clarity it demands. The recognition that some actions remain inexcusable, regardless of the context of war or the passage of time. In the snow-covered field at Baugnez crossroads, 84 American soldiers lost their lives not in combat, but in an act of calculated murder. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as an episode in military history, but as a stark reminder of why the laws of war matter, and of the human cost when they are disregarded. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.